Hey everyone, and welcome to this YouTube channel. I'm Will Metz, or Guillaume Metz, for those of you that can pronounce my name in French. And I'm a guitarist, a college professor of music, theory, and guitar, and the published author of 2 books on music theory for the self-taught musician. My goal in these videos is to empower and educate aspiring guitarists and help them accomplish breakthroughs in their understanding of music theory and how to navigate the fretboard so that they can become better players, improvisers, and composers. Today's episode is going to be all about notes. We're going to talk about what notes are, but also how they are laid out on the fretboard. We're going to talk about why the guitar is usually such a hard instrument to navigate and why it lends itself to people not necessarily trying to understand what's happening underneath their fingers when they're playing chords or scales, etc. A lot of guitarists, as we know, simply learn shapes. They know, for example, that this is a major chord, but they don't know necessarily why it's a major chord. What is a major chord and how is this a major chord? Understand that we're all playing the same music. When a pianist plays an E major chord, they are playing, at some level at least, the same things that when a guitarist is playing this chord. But the fact that these instruments are laid out completely differently makes it much easier for a pianist to really see what's going on immediately in this chord and what notes that chord is made of, as opposed to a guitarist. A lot of guitarists just take this information as a given, they learn the shape, and they move on. And we'll see why this is incredibly limiting at some point if you don't take extra steps after that to understand deeper what's going on over here. We'll talk about some of the advantages that the guitar presents in terms of its layout and its tuning that other instruments such as the piano don't have. We'll see, for example, that the guitarist is an easy instrument to what we call transpose, meaning that if you move a shape, whether it's a scale or chord or anything, up and down the fretboard, it will preserve its quality. So if this is a major chord over here, moving it up here, this remains a major chord. We have a preservation of the quality. We'll also see that if you move those shapes up and down vertically on the fretboard, you get some preservation, but you also get some changes, which again gives birth to some weird things, such as the fact that here, when I play this, I have an E major chord, but when I take this shape and go up, I get a minor chord. So I don't get something totally different, but there is a difference when I transpose up like that. We'll talk about the fact that that complexity of the fretboard is what requires guitarists to use shapes and navigation systems such as the cage system. These systems are all based on reference points and landmarks on the fretboard, and these reference points are notes. And most of those reference points are going to be found on the E, the A, and the D string, which is why I'm going to insist on the fact that if you're going to learn any notes on the fretboard, you absolutely need to know your notes on the E and the A string, low E and A string, at the very least, preferably also the D string, but you could get away with just the E and the A string, and you can already go pretty far in your journey by combining this and the use of shapes and the proper knowledge of these shapes. You can actually achieve quite a bit of mastery just by knowing this. Of course, it's better if you know your notes everywhere on the fretboard. Now, to achieve this, if you're a guitarist that's maybe struggling to learn the notes on the E, the A, and the D string, or you don't really know how to do that, I will give you some specific exercises that I personally use and that I recommend all my clients, students, everybody to use so that they can actually learn those notes quickly and efficiently and permanently as well. All right, so let's get right into it. What are notes? So this may sound like a kind of a basic, boring question to you. And most people kind of like roll their eyes and like, oh, well, okay, I know notes. And then sometimes I dig a little deeper and I say, okay, well, what are notes then? Tell me, give me a definition. All right, if you cannot give a quick and kind of all-encompassing accurate definition of something quickly when somebody puts you on the spot, if you kind of go like, that means you don't know what notes are. All right. This is the definition of understanding, is having those clear language tools to really define and conceptualize what you're using. And that's what we're going to do a lot over here. So we're using notes every single day when we're playing music, guitar, every other instrument. If you don't know a quick definition of what you are using every single day to play music, then your foundation is definitely, at the very least, very shaky. So a note is simply the musical name given to the frequency of a sound wave. Any sound that you can hear is basically the result of a frequency that then reaches your eardrum, and the eardrum will vibrate at that specific frequency, and your brain interprets it and hears it. Frequencies are measured in hertz, which is basically the number of vibrations of that sound wave per second. The lower the frequency, the lower the pitch of the sound, right? The bassier, basically. And then the higher the frequency, the higher the pitch. Now, human beings don't hear all the frequencies. We actually hear somewhere between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz, and that high frequency tends to kind of go lower and lower as you get older. You can also have dents in your ability to hear that whole sound spectrum, depending on damage that you might have had to your ears, which is why everyone should really wear earplugs if you're going to a loud show or if you're playing a loud show. So this is where music happens, right? Music by definition needs to be heard in order to be enjoyed. So of course, music is going to happen in this range of between 20 and 20,000 hertz. And one of the first questions I asked myself when I was studying this whole music theory thing is, why is it that we have a finite number of notes? Right? Even if you don't know all the notes yet, you know that there isn't a million notes. It's a finite number. So how do we go from an infinite number of frequency to a finite number of notes? So let's talk about this. In order to make this bridge between the world of physics and the world of notes, the first thing we need is a reference note. And that note is going to be our first bridge between physics and music. The reference note that we use most commonly is the note A, and A is equal to 440 hertz. Now, this is most of the times. You can change the value of A. Again, it's an arbitrary decision that most people agree upon. But it's important that you agree on it, because if you're tuning to this note and someone else tunes to a different definition of A, you won't be able to play together, right? There's some people that actually that you might know, like Amy Winehouse, that use different tuning systems. I think Amy Winehouse is 432, but I would have to check it. Anyways, it's not 440, which is why when you try to pick up her songs, it's hard to find a note. You're like, oh, is it D? Is it D sharp? I don't know. Well, it's somewhere in the middle, which is why you'll never be able to find the right tone unless you tune to her definition of A. Okay, so we have one note for now, right, which is A. And actually, as we'll see, it's specifically A4. Now, this is not enough to get a finite number of notes, but there's something else that's going to come into play. And that's the fact that our ear doesn't hear any increment or change in frequency. You need at least a little bit of a significant change in frequency to hear or perceive a difference. And that's called the just noticeable difference. So here already, by doing this, we understand that we're not going to have an infinite number of notes, because if the increment is too small, we're not going to perceive different notes. The other thing that we have in music that creates this finite number of notes, because even with just that just noticeable difference, that's still a lot of different notes, okay? That's due to the fact that we have a notion of cycle in notes. Notes cycle and repeat, because it turns out that if you take a note and double its frequency, you get a note that is so consonant when played at the same time as the other note that it really sounds like the same note. And there's a physical reality to this, right? If you look at the double of the frequency, when these two sound waves happen at the same time, they hit critical spots in those cycles simultaneously or in sync, which is why these two notes sound very similar. But to think about it differently, that would mean that if an instrument was playing, say, a certain melody, and then another instrument was to play that same melody using all these notes, but doubling the frequency of all these notes, and if they played these at the same time, it would sound like these two instruments are playing the exact same melody. So now we have one note. We have the reference. But we also have other notes because we know that this note can be found, that same note can be found up or down an octave if you double the frequency or divide the frequency in half. So when we talk about A4 as a reference note, why is it A4? It's A4 because it's the fourth audible A. If I divide that frequency 440 in half, and then I get A3, in half I get A2, in half I get A1, and this is basically the lowest A that you would get. If you divide that again, you get too low in frequency, you're getting too close to getting out of the audible sound spectrum, so that's not interesting. So A1 is the first audible A, A4 is our reference note and turns out to be the fourth A after this one. Now A5 would be double 440, so 880 hertz, etc., etc. And by multiplying by 2, at some point you'll get to the highest possible A that you can hear. And now we understand why we actually have a finite number of notes. We're getting closer to our musical system. Now we have to understand what happens between an A and an A that's an octave after this. In our Western world, which kind of crafted the whole music theory system on the piano as the main instrument, we use what we call the equal temperament system. And when we do this, we take an octave and divide it into 12 equal chunks of frequencies. And each of these chunks is called a half step. This is why you have 12 frets between the open E and the E over here up an octave. 12 frets, 12 half steps. This is where you find notes in the equal temperament system. So if you're wondering, hey, could there be a note between, like smaller than a half step, like a quarter step? Of course. Again, this is a system. We're mapping physical frequencies, okay? But this note doesn't really have a name, a proper name in the equal temperament system. This note would effectively just be out of tune. There's other places and all sorts of other types of music, African music. You might know of the blues scale, for example. The reason why the blues scale is so different sounding and that there's really a lot of problems and contradictions that happen when you try to analyze the blues with the Western music theory system is that the notion of notes in these African scales is much more flexible. It's not like this is this frequency, this is A over here, and if you're not right there, you're either on another note or you're out of tune. No, there's a much more flexible notion. Notes can change in frequency by an eighth of a step, a quarter of a step, well, a few cents, right? It's different cents. We'll see what that means maybe in another video, but basically you can divide each half step into 100 cents. That gives you a much finer definition of where notes or frequencies can be between two notes. Regardless, the only thing to remember from this is that it is a system that we use to build our conception of music theory in the Western world. It is the system that all or most of the instruments you know are tuned to. But there are some instruments that absolutely cannot go away from that equal temperament system. If you look at a piano, unless you have a little, if you're playing a synthesizer and you have a little, a little wheel that allows you to bend towards other notes, you're stuck into that 12-note system. The only way to get a different tuning is to go ahead and tune your piano differently. The guitar is kind of a cool instrument because you get the best of both worlds. You get the frets, when it's well tuned, will put you exactly on the notes that you want to play of that 12-note equal temperament system. But by using bends and other techniques, you can actually fluctuate around these notes and get quarter steps or even smaller increments, which is why you can really get those fine and nuanced colors of the blues, for example, on the guitar. At a blue note, a lot of people learn the blue note as a half step above over here, the fourth, sharp 4, but it really can be a little bit, it can be found anywhere sometimes between the 4th and the 5th. And if you don't understand this, don't worry. I'm just trying to show you this is a half step. This is it's not really a half step. It's probably somewhere around the quarter step. And that's where a lot of the blue notes are. They're not on the equal temperament system. So you understand why the people that were first introduced to these scales in the Western world, they really heard this as out of tune. They're like, this is weird. This type of music doesn't play the notes that we're used to. But then little by little, blues became a big part of the popular music. And now it sounds like blues. It sounds cool. People are used to those sounds, but understand that these sounds are different. They don't really fit in the equal temperament system. Okay, so to wrap this all up, we have a reference note A. That note repeats at every octave, and you get to this octave by dividing or multiplying the frequency of a note by 2, all right? So we have a bunch of A's in our sound spectrum, and now we're thinking about how to put different notes in one octave, so between A and the octave above, all right? And we found out that in our system, we divide this into 12 equal chunks of frequencies. Now, how are we going to place our notes, and how are we going to name the notes that are between A and A that's an octave above? Well, here again, you can ask yourself many questions. Is there a name for each specific spot, for each specific note? It turns out that what we did is, instead of giving a name and really like a letter for each of those half steps, we actually divided this octave by following the path or the division that is used when you play a major scale, or actually, if you start with A, would actually be the natural minor scale. Now, these two scales are the most popular scales in the Western system. They're all the white keys on your keyboard, right? Those scales are kind of the reference scales. So it makes sense that we would use this partitioning of the octave, the one that's used when you play a major scale, specifically the C major scale, which again has, like we'll see, has no sharps, no flat. So we use this partitioning to get our notes in the system. So you start with A, and you go up a whole step, which is 2 half steps. You get B. B goes up a half step to C. And again, why a half step? Because that's how notes are organized or are separated when you are playing a major scale or natural minor scale, which these two are related. They follow that same sequence, as we'll see, but in a different order. Whole step after C, you get D. Whole step after D, you get E. Half step after E, F. And then whole step to G, and whole step back to A. This is where our main reference notes are placed within an octave, starting with A. Now, why don't we start with C, right? Why don't we start this partitioning with C when we build this system, right? Because again, it's like I said, it's the C major scale that really is the most fundamental scale in our Western system. And that's a great question. And it's actually different between countries. In France, for example, all our musical system is based with starting with Do, and Do is actually the equivalent of C. So we go Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Si, Do. That's C, D, E, F, G, A, B. So we don't have that alphabetic conception of music. We actually start with our reference as the major scale. But what's weird is we do still tune to the note A, which is La. And in this case, in our system, the reference note isn't the first note. It's the 6th note. So you can see how both these systems are kind of interesting, right? One system, we tune to A, and so it makes sense that it would be our first note, but we actually are not really using the major scale as a reference for the alphabets, for the notes and the alphabet. We use the A natural minor scale, which is a relative to the major scale. And in countries such as France, yes, we actually use our main division of the octave as starting with C, not A, Do. But when we tune, we're actually tuning not to the first note, but to the 6th note, because La, A, is the 6th note after C. Again, you can see all these are systems. Systems are going to come with advantages and disadvantages, and sometimes some contradictions, not only within the system, but between different countries and how they see this system. Okay, so that's cool, but that doesn't tell us how to name the notes that are between, for example, A and B. There's a note between A and B because we know that there is a whole step, so 2 half steps between A and B. So there is a nameable frequency there, and how are we going to name that frequency? To name this frequency, we need to use something else. And this is what we call accidentals, sharps or flats. Now, understand that a sharp just takes the pitch of a note and increases it by a half step. And you can do this to any note as many times as you want. You could sharpen A twice and then you would get to B. So A sharp sharp is the same frequency as B. Then you might be tempted to ask yourself, well, is that something that you would use sometimes? The answer is yes. And in this case, I can't tell you exactly why that is, but there are some cases in which A sharp sharp might make more sense than B. It's the same with flats, by the way. So flat takes the pitch of a note down by a half step, and you can flatten a note as many times as you want. In some cases, flat flat might make more sense. But the original use of these accidentals, even though again it generates sometimes some weird things, the original use of these accidentals is to actually name those notes that are in the middle, that don't have a letter associated with them. So how do you name the note between A and B? Well, now that you know about sharps and flats, you realize that you can name it two different ways. You can name it A sharp as A increased by a half step, or B flat as B decreased by a half step. And then you might be tempted again to say, why? Why would we have two names for the same thing? And that's a valid question. And again, in this case, I'm going to have to tell you, trust me, it makes sense when you start exploring the system and how it works, right? But right now, you do have to trust me. I cannot fully explain if you're just starting in music theory. And if you're already pretty good at it, then you'll understand why, all right? This might all be just a reminder, and in this case, you can totally speed up the video to the actual fretboard part and navigation part and everything. Okay, that's it. We built our musical system. We know where the notes are and how to name them. Every octave, so notes basically circulate. I like to see them like a spiral. You go up or down in pitch, and it's not really a line because again, we are circulating around the notes A sharp, B, blah, 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 blah. And then at some point, boom, we reach the note A again, an octave above. And then we go up again, which is why I like to present notes in a circular manner. We're going up and down around a circle of different notes. And every time we go around fully on one side or the other, we go up and down an octave. Okay, so how and where to find these notes on the fretboard? Well, you look at the fretboard and you think to yourself, this is going to take some work. And you're right, it is going to take some work. On the piano, which again is the instrument that kind of originated this whole system, it's extremely obvious. There are visual landmarks that make it very, very easy to see where notes are. You look at the pattern of an octave on the piano, starting with any note, but let's start with C, and you'll see exactly where the notes that don't have sharps or flats are, and where those notes that have accidentals are because they have black keys instead of white keys. So it's very easy to find your way on a keyboard and to spot a note immediately. On the fretboard, we do not have such a thing. It's impossible to know where sharps or flats are when you look at your fretboard, all right? So how are we going to do this? Well, let's talk about it. First, we need to know how to find the notes, how this whole thing works over here. Each of the open strings is going to be associated with a specific note. You might already know this, but when you tune a guitar, the low note is an E, then A, then D, then G, then B, and then E again. Now that E is not one, but two octaves above the low E over here. Okay, so why would we tune the guitar like this? And this is crucial. You need to understand that if you're going to understand anything that we're going to do after this. The guitar is tuned this way, and it only makes sense if your main preoccupation is to be able to play full open chords with all these strings resonating at the same time. And then really to play any chords over here in their full form where you can play a chord on as many strings as possible. So the guitar is tuned this way so that we can have access to most chords, or as many chords as we can, in their open form, such as this one, major, C major. the guitar was designed so that these chords sound good. And we'll see a little bit later, if you want to get nerdy, that if your goal was not that, for example, if your goal was to preserve the symmetry of the shapes and not have that weird thing where here you have a major chord, but when you move this shape up, you get a minor chord, you could tune the guitar differently to make sure that that's a major shape, and then when you go up, that's also a major shape. But if you did that, then the way you would tune the guitar would prevent you from really playing any shape that has more than 3 or 4 notes. You wouldn't be able to play these nice full shapes played on all the strings, all right? This is, we really wanted, basically, I don't know who designed the guitar in the first place, but it was important to have an E here and an E that repeats over here, to have that symmetry and that low note and high note be the same one on each given fret, all right? This is where the tuning of the guitar comes from. This is why and where the cage system comes from. It only is born from the fact that the guitar was tuned for open chords. And so even when you go and want to navigate around the fretboard up and down, you're going to be using those same shapes that we use to play open chords, but just taken up the fretboard. Okay, so now let's talk about what happens between these strings. How is that tuning actually organized? Studying this will explain already some of the weird things that happen in terms of moving shapes around. Specifically, again, like we talked about, why is this here E major, and then if I take this exact arrangement of fingers and move it up, it's an A minor. What's happening over here? Well, this is due to the fact, and we'll study this again a little bit later or another video about the cage system and those specific chord voicings, but it's due to the fact that most strings on the guitar are tuned in a fourth, meaning that they're a fourth or perfect fourth apart, which is 2½ steps if you count from one note to the next. So between E and A, there is a perfect fourth. You can hear that sound, all right? Then between A and D, same thing. There is 2½ steps, and you get it's perfect fourth. Same thing between D and G. But between G and B, if you did count the number of steps, there's actually only 2 steps. G and B are a major third apart, not a perfect fourth. And because of that, we have basically a half step missing from that note to the next if we wanted to have a complete symmetrical tuning. And again, we do this because it makes things easier in the grand scheme of things when you want to play open strings. Sure, it doesn't make much sense that that's major and that's minor, but that's an okay sacrifice considering all the awesome things that that tuning allows us to do on the guitar. So how do we compensate for that? Well, because between G and B there is a half step missing, if you wanted to get a major chord, because this note over here is the third, that's where we give our major or minor quality to the chord. If you want to get a major chord, you have to take this third, which here is minor, up a half step. And that's why over here in this shape, which we call the A shape, and we'll see this later, and if you want a major chord, you need to have all these fingers over here lined up on one fret as opposed to like this over here, right? So again, we'll study that a little bit later in depth and when we tackle the cage system. For now, just understand that that system of tuning is very useful, but it comes with some confusing aspects to it, right? Such as this one. Now let's look at what happens on a given string. Okay, so I know that this is E, great. What happens when I go up from this string, the open string, to the first fret, second fret? Well, we already talked about it a little bit, but what happens is you move up a half step, all right? So from E over here, because there is only a half step again between E and F, you don't need to use sharps in this case. The first note here is going to be F. And then if we move up here, we find ourselves between F and G, so this note can be called F sharp or G flat, all right? And etc., etc. And as I move up, at one point I get to this fret, which is the one that has the double dot. Now that double dot is not just to be pretty, it's because this fret indicates that we've actually gone up an octave. All the open strings repeat on that fret. So we have the same E, A, D, G, D. Up an octave from the open string. And then it repeats again. So we'll see that this is already a problem because we're defining notes in reference to the open string. And so it's tempting to kind of not do the work of actually learning these notes, but to use this knowledge and use a sequential memory. Go, okay, that's E, that's F, G, and then move up like this to finally find the notes up here by moving up from your original reference. When you do this, you use sequential memory, and it's not the type of memory that's going to allow you to be quick enough to find your notes on the fretboard in a way that's actually useful. But what's important to notice here is that we can see why the guitar is going to be such a difficult instrument to navigate. For one, each string is tuned differently. So the notes you get on each fret is different on each string. That's confusing. Then another thing is that we have landmarks on the guitar. We have those dots here, for example. We'd be tempted to think, well, maybe on the dots, it's the notes that don't have sharps, and then around the dots, it's the notes that have sharp or flats. Well, that's just not true, actually. And on some strings, some notes on the dots will be a note that's not sharp or flat. Like here, this is a G, all right? But in other ways, it's not true, right? In other notes, for example, this one on this dot is a C sharp. It's not, so it does have a sharp or a flat. So these dots don't really tell us anything that we can generalize to the whole fretboard. We'll see that they're important landmarks, but they're not things that we can use as simply as when you see a black note on the keyboard, it's a sharp or a flat. That's very straightforward. So we have a weird tuning system with asymmetries, a fretboard with landmarks that really don't seem to give us any meaningful information, at least for now. 6 strings that are all tuned differently, except of course for the low E string and the high E string, so really 5 different strings. And then here's the final things on how and why the guitar is difficult to navigate. You don't look at your guitar like this. You're looking at your fretboard with perspective, all right? And let me show you so we can see, make sure we're seeing the same thing over here. This is what I'm seeing. So you really have to do what most guitars do if you want to see the whole thing, is you have to kind of bend your head like this. You have to stretch your neck out to really try to see all the notes over here. But then again, it's not as clear as just having everything laid out in front of you, all right? So when you look at your line of sight, the strings that you see the best are the E and the A string. Then the D string is already kind of blurry. G string, I can hardly see it. And then finally the B string is very hidden, and then you can kind of see the E string again. It pops out over there. And we know that it's the same notes as the low E string. But again, odds are stacking against the guitarist to know what is going on over here. All right. Now people will say, well, the bass is the same, the violin is the same, all this, and that's true to some extent. But remember, these instruments only have 4 strings. And so they don't really have, and usually the fretboard is not nearly as long, at least for violins. They don't have that B string that creates the asymmetry. For example, on the bass, there is no asymmetry because you're stopping at the G string most of the time. And so you're actually tuned in fourths. So all your shapes, like we'll see, are going to be symmetrical. So all the odds are stacking against the guitarist to really efficiently know how to navigate the fretboard. All right. And we have this weird perspective thing where we kind of see the E and the A string. And this is why it's easier to find the notes and learn the notes on these 2 strings. Not only is it easier, but it's essential and it's very practical. All right. For the other strings, of course, it's going to be a little more complicated. Now, before we get into the next section, in which I tell you the importance of knowing your notes on the E and the A string and how to practice this, I want to talk about some advantages of the guitar that other instruments don't have. For one, it's the coolest instrument, but that's just between you and me. There's other advantages. One of them is the fact that you can very, very easily transpose shapes horizontally, all right? And that's why shapes are extremely useful for the guitarist. So for example, if I know that this here is a major shape, all right? That means that when I play this arrangement of fingers, I get the sound of a major chord. Well, if I move this shape up and down the fretboard, I still get a major chord. Now here's the thing. Most guitarists stop here. You cannot stop here. You have to know what is a major chord. Why is this a major chord, all right? Why does this arrangement of fingers make a major chord? In what way it makes a major chord? Where is the root? And where are the other notes, right? The third and the fifth that make a major chord. And again, if you don't know this theory, there will be other videos, or you can look at the description down below. But something is happening under each finger. And it's happening in a similar way to someone that would be playing that same chord on the piano. Your job as a guitarist is to know what's happening underneath your fingers. You cannot just learn major shape and then that's it and stop there. Educate yourself to know exactly what you're doing, okay? Now, however, even when you do know what's going on, it becomes incredibly easy to kind of move this around. You don't have to think about that knowledge all the time, like this is the third, this is the fifth, etc. I'm not always constantly thinking about that. I can retrieve this information, but at the end of the day, if I want to play a G major chord like this one, my fingers can already go into that shape. I know where to put my reference, which is the root on the low E string, and boom, I've got a G major chord. You want to change to A major? No problem. I can just take this shape up, move my reference, which is the root, up to the note A, and I get an A major. That requires me to know where that reference, what a reference is, right? In the case of a chord, it's usually the root. And so what the reference is, where it is in that shape, right? Because there's some shapes, like we'll see, like the A shape, where it's not as obvious. In this shape, your reference, your root is on the A string. But because most guitars bar this whole thing over here, they think that their reference is still on the E string and that's where the root is. Wrong. Now the root is on the A string. And so you can still use the benefits of that transpositions. For example, here, if I'm in D major, I know if I want to go to C major, what I need to know is where's my reference? It's here. And currently it's on the note D. If I want to play a C major, I need to find the note C, right? My new reference on the A string, and it's going to be over here, all right? So, but once I know these shapes, everything, scales, modes, intervals, chords of three notes, triad, tetrad, everything, they can all be transposed. So once you know, you understand the shapes, where they come from, how they're made, what notes they're made of, and specifically we'll see what intervals they're made of, then you can transpose them all over the fretboard as long as you know where your reference is, all right? If I say C major scale, you need to know two things. One, where C is. Because if you don't know where C is, you might be playing a major scale, you might be playing the right shape, right? But oops, right there, my reference was D, so I'm actually playing a D major scale. So I need to know where to start that pattern, where the reference of that pattern is if I want to play the proper scale. Now you see where I'm going with this. The advantages of the guitar and how you can transpose it and use those simple references to navigate the fretboard using shapes. The other side of that, right, of the use of shapes is knowing where to put these shapes. And if you want to know where to put these shapes, you absolutely need to know the notes on the E and the A string, because that's where the reference for these shapes, and by reference I mean a tonic, which is the first note of a scale, if we're talking about a scale, the root, if we're the lowest note, the bass note of a chord, if we're talking about a chord, and those are the two main ones. You'll also have later on a key center, if you're in a specific key, like the key of, say you're in the key of C major, knowing where the key center is on your fretboard. Regardless, it's important to know that you need to know where these references are. And because of how we look at our guitar, because of the fact that there is a special importance given to the low notes, the bass notes usually when you play music, right? We like to base things off the lowest note and organize notes from the bass, the lowest pitch note, and up, all right? You notice scales are usually defined starting with the first lowest note in the octave. What is a D major scale? It's a major scale that's based on D. So you need to know where these landmarks are. and you need to know how to find them on the E and the A string, because that's where you're going to be most efficient at finding your landmarks, because those two strings are just, factually speaking, you can't contest this, the strings that guitarists can easily learn, and then once they know their notes there, they can find their way easily. All right? So, for example, I'll give you an example again. You want to play an A major pentatonic scale. You got to think two things. What is an A major pentatonic scale? All right? In this channel, for those people that are interested over here, I don't want you to just learn the shapes. You need to know what things are. What is a major pentatonic scale? What intervals or notes is it made of? And once you know this, you learn the shape, and then you don't have to always be thinking about that, but you should be able to retrieve the definition of something, all right? So one of the shapes of the A major pentatonic scale is this one. All right, now, I played it here starting with the low notes, and we'll see that that can be a problem to always play your scales like that in that sequence, but I don't have to, right? I know that this is the group of notes that I have access to in this shape if I want to be playing in the A major pentatonic scale. So why is it A major pentatonic? It's A major pentatonic because with this shape, my reference is the note A, right? A major, on the low E string. And once I know where A is, and I know that pattern, I can play A major pentatonic. And I don't have to play those notes in order. I can start anywhere in this pattern, and I still get the same A major pentatonic. You want to play C major pentatonic? No problem. Where is my reference in this shape? It's on the low E string. So all I need to do if I want to take this pattern and move it to C is go up to the C that's on the E string, which turns out to be over here, and play the same exact pattern. Now I have a C major pentatonic. Different notes, right? But the relationship between these notes is the same. The relationship meaning the intervals in this scale. And again, if you don't understand intervals, check out the books, check out other videos, all right? But this is one of the magic powers that you can have on the guitar. But again, you can only take advantage of this cool symmetry on the guitar and the fact that you can move up and down the fretboard if, one, you know the shapes, right? If you don't know what the shape of a major chord is, you won't be able to play a major chord. Two, you know why it's a major shape, what makes it a major shape, what makes a major chord, basically. What's the definition of a major chord? And where those notes are laid out in this shape. For example, in this shape, the E shape, my root, my reference is on the low E string. Then I have my fifth, then my root again up an octave. So you could also use the D string as your reference if you wanted to, see? But the E string is usually the one that people know better, so we'll use this one. Then the major third, which only happens once over here on the G string, 4 strings after the root, right? Boom, 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 boom. That's where my third is, which is why, by the way, if you take this finger off, you get a minor chord, side note. Then the fifth over here on the B string, and back to my reference A, the 1 over here. So 1, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1. Now that's what it means to know a shape, why it's organized like that, and what's happening under each finger. So that's the first part. And then the second part is you need to know your notes on the E and the A string so that you can get to those reference and actually play the right chord or the right scale. I hope this makes sense. So how to learn your notes? You got to learn your notes. I think now you realize that it's important. So here are some exercises. The main thing to remember is that you need to get away from the sequential learning or finding of the notes. The minute I see someone go, okay, F, G, stop. You're doing it the wrong way. Sequential memory is not fast enough to navigate something, all right? That would be like if you're trying to navigate in a neighborhood and the only way you know how to navigate is to start from a specific spot and then go all around that path every time. So you want to go to the supermarket, you got to go back to the church, and then do coffee shop, blah, 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 and then finally get to the supermarket. You want to go to the coffee shop, which turns out what's right here, you still have to go back to your first spot and go back, all right? You're wasting a lot of time. And I like to express this or show people how limited that type of memory or type of thinking is by asking people, hey, you know your alphabet, right? Okay, try to talk or try to say the alphabet backwards starting from L. I guarantee you're going to think about it, you're going to stop, you're like, oh, all right, you have to go back to A. We learn our alphabet sequentially. People don't really know the alphabet really well. They know the sequence starting with A, but that's basically it. If I ask you to skip skip letters or go backwards, starting in random spots, you will be lost. Well, in music, it's the same thing. You cannot use your sequential memory to find notes on the fretboard. It is too slow. It is incomplete. You will always be one step behind when you want to be one step before, or what do you say, in advance in music. So what do you use to learn this? You need to use your visual cortex. So you need to learn how to visualize these notes and kind of like look at your fretboard all together and be able to use your eyes and not your sequential memory. And two, kinesthetic. Kinesthetic meaning how it feels. What does it feel like to go from an F to a C on the fretboard? Is it a small movement? Is it a big movement? Right? These things, kinesthetic is your ability to find your way through touch and movement. What does it feel like to go from here to there, right? So by leveraging these types of memories, kinesthetic and your visual memory, together you'll be able to quickly find your way on the fretboard, which is what you want. This is where those dots finally come in handy. Even though they don't tell you anything about sharps or flats, they do give you some sort of indication, a visual landmark that you can use to navigate around. But it's still going to require you to learn some things by heart, by repeating it, okay? So the first thing I recommend is to go and learn the notes string by string. So we're going to start with the E and then A, and I'll make sure that you're really good on the E and the A string, and then finally maybe add the D string. And then I want you to just kind of like take a break at that point. You can do a lot on the guitar without knowing the notes necessarily on the G and the B string, as long as you do the other part, which is learning your shapes and learning the chord tones or intervals in each of these shapes. So to learn the notes on a string, you're going to use these landmarks, and here's how I do it. First of all, I try to think of, I know my open string, it's E. Then I try to think about where is the first note on the string that has no sharps and no flats. It's going to be different on each string. So on the E string, it's the first fret, F, okay? F is over here. Then I'm going to start linking these dots. I'm going to use these dots to find the other notes that don't have sharps or flats. On the E string, I get gab. I use this as to remember. You get G on the first dot, A on the second dot, B on the third dot. Gab. All right, but that's not good enough again. Here we're still kind of sequencing. What I want you to do is start looking at these frets and think G, A, B, G, and kind of go back and forth and try to really give a name to these dots. It's like when you see this dot and you think of the E string, that's G. That's G right there. Here, that's B. That's A. F. All right? And you start bouncing back and forth, visualizing these things. The two other notes are actually going to be on either side of this dot. Remember, on this dot, you don't have a note that doesn't have sharps or flats because here is B and C is only a half step above. So C turns out to be to the fret that's directly on the left of this dot and D directly on the right of this dot. Finally, on the double dot, we're back on the open tuning. So again, look at your fretboard. You've got F, that's your first landmark without sharps or flats. The open string is E. Gab. And then on one side of this dot, you get C, and on the other side, you get D. All right? On the A string, it's a little bit different. So on the A string, you have open A, and then the first note that doesn't have sharps or flats is B, but B isn't on the first fret anymore. It's on the second fret, right over here. Then those three first dots are going to be the beginning of a C scale. So C scale, think starting your alphabet with C, C, D, E. All right? No sharps, no flats. So C, D, E. All right? That's the beginning of a C scale. And then we get that same phenomena where we have F on the left of this dot and G on the other side of this dot, because there is only a half step in our alphabet and our partitioning of the octave between E and F. And finally, back to G. Okay, so now, again, once you start kind of like warming up to each of these strings, start with the E string alone, then the A string. Notice that we don't do any sharps or flats yet. What I want you to do is you're going to open, and I'm going to link to this in the description. It's an exercise sheet that'll tell you exactly how to practice this. But essentially, you're going to open a random note picker on the internet. I'm going to go ahead and it's called a random note generator. So you're going to open this random note picker. You're going to make sure you select about 10 notes and start with no sharps and flats, and then randomize. This will generate a series of random notes. And then what I want you to do is take a metronome. You can open it right here on the next tab, metronome over here. And then I usually recommend starting at 60 beats per minute. The goal over here is to test yourself. You need to have a time constraint. The only way that your brain is gonna start thinking, oh, I can't use the sequence thing anymore, it's not fast enough, is if you're in a rush to get to the next note. That plus the visual landmarks is what's going to get you to what you want to do. And then again, the speed, because you're going to be reading those notes faster and faster, your brain will also have to rely on kinesthetic memory, kind of knowing where-ish a C is on the E string. And then that plus your visual landmarks will get you to the right spot. But you're not going to be using the counting anymore, for sure. All right? So I'll start at 60 beats per minute. And I'm going to see if I can read every 4 clicks, perhaps. So every 4 clicks, I get to the next note. And I'm going to stick again just to the E string. No sharps, no flat. So I would go B, 2, 3, 4, F. Open E. Do everything before the 12th fret for now. A. 2, 3, 4, G. Etc., etc. If this is too slow, you can either bump up the tempo or do every 2 clicks, right? Let's start with G. And right, if I try to decompose what's happening in my brain so that you can kind of see what it feels like, I see a letter and my hand kind of gets to that area, right? Now, when you're good enough, you get to the actual right note. You can do it with your eyes closed. But at the beginning, it's just going to kind of go where it's supposed to go in the general area. And then you do a little check with your eyes, put it on the right note, and then move back. That's how you get a good reading technique over here, right? You see a note, G. I know I'm going somewhere up here. And then I look, boom, I get the right note. And then I'm already thinking about my next note. Looking ahead, looking ahead. So you do this on the A string. And then you will do this, go faster and faster. Then you'll start adding sharps and flats. So for sharps and flats, again, here you're allowed to do a little step of like, okay, that's a half step. If for example, I see a G sharp. So you would go here in your random note picker. And what you would do is you would activate the sharps and the flats on the generator over here. Once you've activated, so now if I see, for example, a B flat, again, I'll think B is somewhere here and I'm going a half step below. Boom, here's B flat. A sharp, it's the same note. A, boom, etc., etc. So you have a little bit of an extra step here over here, but it's so small, and once you get used to, flat is a half step below or half step above, it's not that big of a deal. You'll get there pretty quickly, okay? After this, I want you to do the exact same thing on the A string. Exact same process. Start with no sharps, no flats, and then add sharps and flats. Cool. Now, when you're good with this, you're going to have to start switching between the E and the A string, because what's going to happen if not is that you're going to be very dependent on one string. And then when you go to the next string, it's going to take you a little time to reset your visualization. It's like changing maps really quickly, basically. And so to do this, the next exercise, what I want you to do is, say you're doing 60 beats per minute every 2 clicks. I want you to do each note on the E string and then on the A string. So in this example, you do B flat on the E string for 2 clicks, and then you would go to A sharp, which turns out is the same note, but over here on the A string. And then say we do F, F on the E string, F on the A string, okay? You can test yourself. If you don't hear the same note, that means you messed up because you're playing the same note twice. And then finally, you're actually gonna switch strings every time you're switching a note. So you would play, this time you would actually play, say we're going from F to E flat, you would go F on the E string, and then instead of going to F on the A string again, you would go straight to E flat on the A string. That is the most complicated exercise, and once you start speeding up, I guarantee it can make your head hurt or your brain hurt a little bit, all right? But this is really the best exercise. You can add as many strings as you want and use that process to learn the notes on every single string. And once you're good on the E and the A string, you can absolutely add the D string, which I recommend. There's other ways to find the notes on the D string against by using, for example, octave shapes between the E and the D string, but that's just an extra step that could be saved in terms of time if you just know your notes on the D string like you know them on the E and the A string. As for G and B, you don't have to worry about them right now. You can worry about them once you're an expert on the E and the A string. Because once you know your notes on the E and the A string, you will already notice a huge difference in your playing if you already know, for example, simple bar chords or stuff like that. And your ability to read music and be able to play the right note every time because you know, one, where your reference is on these chords and where to find these on the E and the A string. If you find this content interesting, and I know this is kind of a longer format content, right? This is not kind of like the quick tip, 5 seconds, do this and become amazing at the guitar. That's just not how it works, right? You can get yourself to play-ish pretty quickly on the guitar and play a few chords, but if you want to get to the next level on the instrument, it takes some work. It takes some focus, some studying. So feel free to watch this video again. Feel free to speed up to the sections that are marked in the video so that you can actually go back to what's interesting to you. Again, there's a PDF that will be linked to how to actually, in fact, practice this and the whole practice routine to find your notes on the fretboard. If this content is interesting, please subscribe. You can also subscribe to my other channels, Facebook, Instagram, if this is something that's interesting to you. I'm also interested to see any comments, and I will reply to those comments, and I'm looking forward to having some constructive conversations about this. In the meantime, I wish you luck in your practice. Take care and have fun out there.